Good morning, my name is Robert Barris. Welcome to Off the Record. I'm your host today. I'm also the managing director of 352. We're an innovation and growth firm here in Atlanta, and we build really cool shit for big companies. We create new ventures, design new business models. I gotta laugh at him. Design new business models, digital products. We try to find paths for growth. We do it in some really cool ways. So you're here at Off the Record, and you're joining a group of more than 600 innovators, and product leaders, business leaders in Atlanta who come to these events on a regular basis. This is our third event this year. I can't remember which, but we're post-pandemic sort of, and so we're back, and we're excited to be able to share this type of knowledge and dialogue with you guys. We started Off the Record in 2017, in support of trying to bring knowledge from really smart folks on this panel to all of you guys. Often the path of innovation and growth is full of fails. It's full of things that don't quite work out when you think it will, and that's not shared enough. And so we wanted to try to bring the knowledge that these folks have. We've obviously been successful, but have also seen some failures along the way to all of you. So it's much community driving as it is knowledge sharing. And so with that, I'm going to introduce these guys. I'll talk about what the event is about around Build by Partner, and then we're going to do a quick exercise as a group and maybe build a little community. So first, to my left, we have a pretty esteemed panel. We've got Bill Nussey. Bill is a partner in Engage and TechSquare venture firms. He spent most of his career as a tech CEO, helping lead several startups to successful exits, including a multi-billion-dollar IPO. No big deal. In between startups, he spent several years as a venture capitalist in Greylock, and in 2014, he sold his MarTech company, Silverpop, to IBM for $300 million. As the VP of Corporate Strategy at IBM, he helped lead the global strategy for their CEO and SVPs. And in this role that Bill's in today, that doesn't make any sense. So give a big hand for Bill. Sometimes your notes get off, folks. It's a live show. It's a live show. There it is. My next guest, Hrishi Talwar. He is the Chief Product Officer of Vesta and brings 20 years of product management and technology experience in the financial services, payments, and mobility space across various organizations. Most recently, he was responsible for identity, fraud, and compliance business at Equifax. He led the overall product strategy, which included the execution of innovation solutions, platforms, leveraging the extensive Equifax and partner data ecosystems. Big round of applause for Hrishi. And last but certainly not least, my friend, my buddy, my partner, Steve Borengasser. Steve currently leads practitioner enablement at 352, but also our product management practice. And Steve's background is deep in product management, brings over 20 years of product strategy and innovation experience, building and launching growing businesses at all stages within Asia Pacific, North American markets at companies like Kimberly-Clark and Vesta. So we're very happy to have Steve on our panel today. Please give it up for Steve. It's awesome. Let's dive into the conversation. So I love that you guys get a chance to learn from each other. I'd love to learn from these guys here. So let me open it up. So I mentioned at the top, Build by Partner is kind of the just do it of phrases. It's obviously very complicated, as was just mentioned. Paralysis can happen. How do you guys think about developing a strategy around Build by Partner? I'll open it up to anyone who wants to start. Or Steve. He seemed real into it, guys.
Really into it. So I think the strategy begins before you have to make the decision, right? So I think you start, if you have an innovation program that's trying to drive change in your organization, you start with a strategic inventory where you take notice of what your strategic assets are and what your strategic capabilities are, so that when that decision comes, you're set up to make a solid decision. So you know, I've got these capabilities and these assets to draw from as a business, and I'm either going to use them in build or partnership, or I need to acquire them, right? As part of whatever innovation program I've got.
What about you guys? How would you build on that? Or
Yeah, I think to me, first of all, whenever we are looking at the strategy, never go to the IT department and ask them to build by partner, right?
Yeah.
I think you'll get to a decision very quickly, but it's not always the right decision. I've always looked at it as to, do we want to own the asset? Do we have the skill set to build on the asset? And is it a commodity play for us where we've got 20 other people that also have a similar asset? Why waste time, energy, money, focus on building something and be a Me Too player, go partner with someone, and if they're really good at it and it's still a commodity play, look at buying them out. But focus on what you're really good at, your core skill set, and build on top of that.
Yeah, so I've been both in the startup world and the large company world, and I think it's a very different question.
Yeah.
In large companies, any action is incredibly difficult, and so partnering is typically a lot easier than building. Buying is incredibly hard, but in large companies, if you actually acquire something, and typically it's the highest political move you can make. So if you want to get promoted in a large company, owning an acquisition is actually one of the best things you can do. Whereas I think for startups, it's about speed. And one of the challenges from a startup's perspective is it's a low-hanging fruit problem, because if you have a set of customers, they're going to say, well, we'd like you to, if you'd sell this too, we'd buy it. And then what happens with so many startups is that you quickly have a portfolio of things you've committed to doing, and the ones that look so easy to grab early on are now you're losing competitively because you can't put the resources, you're so resource constrained. So I think as startups expand, speed and fluidity and flexibility are the primary lens, and so I think too many startups do not partner, and obviously they don't typically acquire, but they don't partner, and I think partnering would be a much better lens for a lot of startups than they think, because it's easy to do the first iteration. It's death to them if they try to do the 10th.
Yeah.
So partner.
So let's talk about mindset for a second. As we're unpacking as you guys were framing it out, some of the competitive advantages you guys might have, the capabilities you may have, and maybe I'll start with you, Hrishi. Talk about mindset. You said, listen, if you go to the IT department, you already know what the answer is going to be. How do you facilitate the mindset amongst either executives around you or other peers in making this strategy viable? Because I would imagine build, as an example, is an easy one to fall into. Of course we can build it, why not, right? We have capability in people. How do you foster the mindset or help others get on board with this thinking?
Yeah, I mean, you've got to think about the asset and the strategic nature of that asset, right? Do you want to build on top of it? Do you want to stay within that business and continue to focus on it? Or is that a means to an end where you are using that as an ingredient into something bigger that you want to build? So you've got to break it out into bite-sized chunks and start debating about where the energy should go, right? I've made the transition from a large company to a mid-sized company, and I think the decision and the thought process is very different. To Bill's point, we always look at partnering first, because we have a finite number of resources. You can't build everything. It doesn't make sense sometimes. And you also have to be very critical about, do you want to own that asset in the long run? Do you want to continue to make that part of the focal growth point of your business? So we're constantly having those discussions as we're thinking about the different components. And you've got to weigh the pros and cons, sometimes build a business case around it. And sometimes the business case yields to, let's partner, let's buy, or let's build.
Bill, I'd love to hear from you, and maybe coming from the startup lens, because you did mention it's hard to think about. I think you said partnering, right?
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit more again about that mindset, and how have you seen maybe changing that mindset amongst peers?
When you start this discussion, like we want to do a thing to be better and more competitive, I think you have to answer really two questions. The first is, who is our customer? And then everyone gives you the answer, and you have to, no, really, who is our customer? Like that, a customer is not the person who will buy from us, because we have a lot of people that buy from us that aren't necessarily who we're serving well. And then I think using that clarity of who you're selling to, you sort of look around and see who else is trying to sell to that customer, and if some of them are flanking you, you might acquire, or but if it's absolutely core, and we use the word core competence loosely and too often, like cloud computing, but I think core competence comes down to, so what is your core competence to own that customer? And one of the things I like to say back when I was VC at Greylock was, there was all startups have one of two models. They make a thing and they try to find all these people to sell it to, or they have an audience and they try to sell as many things to that audience as they can. And I can tell you empirically that the latter wins almost every single time, and the former often born out of people who love to create products and are engineers and look at this cool thing I've created, and everyone's going to buy it, and guess what they do? And then you have an untenable customer because you've got multiple go-to-market channels. And so that's where you partner and you narrow your customer base down and focus vigorously on what does this customer base really, really want, and try to partner for the rest of it.
It makes sense. Steve, any thoughts, builds there?
Well, you asked about decision influence.
That's right.
So how do I influence someone to get on board with my recommendation for that decision? And I think that decision influence is a tailored experience. So you're if I'm talking to an ego-driven CEO that I'm trying to influence, no offense, Robert, I'm going to talk about, like, here's how we build a legacy together, right? If I'm talking to Nate, who's a CFO, and he's number-driven, I'm going to build an economic story for Nate. And if I'm talking to a sales leader, I might talk about speed, right? So I don't know how to answer that generally, other than, all those things have to be considered when you are making the build buy decision, because you usually have a number of people you're trying to influence and create a win-win for yourself, your customer, and your organization as part of that decision.
Well, it sounds very much like a marketer, right? You're thinking about your audience, who you're really trying to cater to and influence. Go ahead, Bill.
I think, and just to make sure it's said, because in recognition of you buying breakfast, you should probably look at a third-party firm that can come in as a consultant and help you do it. And I can think of a few off the top of my head, but
very nice, very nice. So let's unpack each of them a little bit more. So I'd like to actually start with the partner side of it, because that feels like one of the more challenging ones, just my impression only. I guess, talk to me about how each of you have thought about, let's just say, the types of partnerships that might be important for recent organizations that you're working with or for, and then maybe talk about some of the pitfalls that you guys have run into in that, because those are some of the challenges that many of these people will experience. So, Hrishi, you want to start?
Okay. Yeah. So, the way I've looked at partnerships, there's a play where you are acquiring something or they're building something for you that becomes part of your overall offering in the market, or it's a distribution play where you're trying to get into a market and you feel like by partnering, it's a faster path to more customers instead of you trying to do that organically. There are pitfalls in both, right? If they're building something for you as an ingredient, do you have the right amount of time to do the due diligence to figure out if whatever component they're providing, does that really fit the bill? That does require a lot more than just looking at a 10,000-foot view of that component and saying, yes, this makes sense, because you're so focused on speed to market. The pitfall on the distribution side is making sure that the partner has the right incentive structure to actually help you with the distribution. We've seen that so many times in my current company and my previous company. We'll go sign all these partners, great. We make announcements on LinkedIn, we'll write white papers, blogs, and then you sit there 2 months, 3 months, 4 months later, you're like, where's the revenue? What is this partner doing? Why isn't the sales team that's on the street going and pushing the value of this partnership? And the most common reason for that is the person that's driving or selling the product for you on the street does not know how they get incentivized. And if they don't get incentivized, you talk to anyone in sales, they're like, if I don't make money, this is not worth my time.
That's a very sobering story. I saw a lot of head nods and quiet, oh shit. Yeah.
We used to call those Barney partnerships back from the old Purple Dinosaur. For most of you, this was a cartoon show for children, and the dinosaur would jump out, I love you, you love me. And so we used to call those Barney partnerships because all you do is you put out a press release and then the partnership's finished, that's the end of it. But
Mission accomplished.
Yeah, exactly. And then someone gets in, someone internally, someone has it as one of their OKRs or whatever, and they look, I got a partnership, the press release is out there, I'm on to the next one, right? Mm-hmm. But I had to just tell you a funny story about the difference between big and small companies and partnerships. I think somebody said it when they were sharing their insights. Silverpop was this company I ran for years based here, and we had partnerships all over the world. And they were critical for our revenue and delivery. We had a marketing tech product, so the agency type companies were our partners, and they were part of the value proposition to our ultimate customers. And this was so core. We had a whole team of partnership people. By the way, ironically, they're all together at Full Story right now, which is just kind of interesting. And so IBM loved our partnerships, and they acquired us, and they said, this is so, I mean, you guys have the best partnerships all over the world, and your partners, we've talked to them in diligence, they love you guys. And so we just need them to sign some paperwork. Like, of course. So our partner team sends out the paperwork, and this was like in the first couple of weeks of the acquisition, and this was the first time the nuclear bomb started going off. Acquisitions are always hard. And no one paid attention to this, right? That's coming back, and the partner's like calling me, have you seen, do you have any idea? It's like, you partner will guarantee to pay us $10 million a year, and like a partner was giving us $200,000 a year. And you will take all liabilities over everything that happens. IBM has no role or control, cannot, and you are warranting our software to the customer. I mean, it's just so ridiculous. And they effectively shut down the entire partnership program. And this is before I figured out how IBM worked, and so we just sort of, you can see the scars still on my forehead. But it's funny, 'cause somebody said, in the large companies, a partnership means, what are you going to do for me? And how much are you going to pay me to let my brand be circling around your brand? And I think that is such an unhealthy place. And one thing that's so cool about what we do at Engage is that we do partner with these large companies, but we're working with them in a way internally that all those, it's a very human kind of relationship. And so we've somehow managed to get past those default approaches they have to outsiders, and we can then bring that to the startups we work with, which is fantastic. But it is hard for large companies to see a balanced partnership, I think, by default.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Steve, any other anecdotes or stories there?
Yeah, I mean, I got maybe a nuance on the big company, small company situation. So I was working for a client when I was working on a project at 352, and it was a large insurance company trying to enter the home services space with a digital delivery, and we wanted to get into market quickly to test things, and so we found a partner that, like, it felt like a good fit. They're looking for scale. We're looking for quick, nimble ways to test a value proposition in market. And are there any Canadians in the room? Like, yes. So they were Canadian, and we love working with Canadians. I don't know why. I just love them. It's fun to work with. So the problem was, it took 9 months to solidify the partnership, right? We were trying to test some things in the background, but by the time we got to a point where we could actually test something in market, they were like on their 4th or 5th iteration, which looked very different from what our client wanted to test. So our hypotheses that we had built, we had the thing that we wanted to test looked nothing like what they were now selling. So we had to move on ultimately from that partnership, because it wasn't gonna help, wasn't gonna fit with the business as we imagined. So it was less about, I mean, I guess risk aversion was a part of it, or muscling the small guy around. It was more because big companies aren't nimble. Your partner is anxious and will move on without you if they're small, and can do that. And so you have to think about the future trajectory and partnering with a company that's going where you're going, I think, in that case. So.
I appreciate it. Let's talk.
I like Canadians too.
You like Canadians as well? They seem like nice people. Yeah. Let's talk about acquisition. Obviously, you lived through one. Maybe I start with you. Again, from the inside out, I would imagine you have a different perspective than the outside in, which is, hey, we're going to want to acquire someone versus being acquired. What would you share about how should companies think about acquisition and what that's like?
I've been on both many times. I've actually acquired like 30 companies over my career, and I think there's a saying. Winston Churchill once said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the rest. And I think anytime you find a strategic merger with somebody and you put it together, it's going to be an absolute disaster, and everyone's going to be mad. But the fact is, it's better than the alternative, and it's probably better than any other option you have. And so I think the truth of acquisitions, and particularly the more strategic they are to either the seller or the buyer, acquirer, is that you have to take off your expectation that you can operate through an acquisition. It's going to be chaos. And that doesn't mean you have to have missed numbers. It doesn't mean, but in terms of, with people, when Silverpop got acquired, it's like, well, I sort of owned this. and I did it fine, and then somebody from IBM says, well, I own it for the entire world, so you work for me now, practically, even though you still work for Silverpop, and so I can't do the thing, I can't go to these conferences, and there's 1,000 of these little things, like we had budget for this, well, IBM doesn't do that. And the other funny one is, the extreme is, well, we're gonna keep you entirely separate. That's among the 3 great lies told in business is we're gonna acquire you and you're gonna be entirely independent. And you just, all right, let's see. 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, and then it just stops.
It's never happened.
Yeah, it lasts for a little while. It's all good intentions. So I think the thing that I've seen, having done a lot of them from both sides, and it's such a silly, trite answer, but truly it's culture. Yeah. And how do you measure? Who makes the decision whether it's a culture fit or not? But I think IBM was a great, I'm not sure I'm proud of this, but IBM was a great culture fit for Silverpop. Thoughtful, methodical, not crazy in the way we do things. And so culture fit is the biggest thing, because you can look across the table to everybody, and look at each other. IBMer looks at Silverpop, or Silverpop looks at one of the companies we acquired, and you have a connection. And from that, you can actually get the work done. But if somebody thinks this is a spreadsheet exercise and a contract exercise, you're likely to be, I think something like 90% of acquisitions are considered unsuccessful, or 80%. It's an enormously high number, and there's a reason, because people look at it through the lens of that press release, through the spreadsheet and the contracts, and they just assume everyone's going to line up. I think that's it is so much about the squishy stuff that it's easy to miss.
That's awesome. I'd love to come back around to culture in a couple of minutes, because I was going to ask a follow-up on it, and you hit it. So let me ask the other guys. When you think about acquisition, either again being acquired or thinking about acquisition, what are some of the other, I guess, learnings you might have had, or strategic thinking that you might want to give to this group to help them better think about when and where that might be the right fit?
Yeah, to me, acquisitions are a lot of fun till you actually sign the paper, right?
Absolutely.
Everyone's really excited about the fact that you got acquired, or you've acquired another company, and you go and you thump your chest and talk about all the amazing things the two companies are going to do together. But that's when the chaos begins, to Bill's point. People on both sides are trying to figure out how they fit, if they fit, right? That's always a scary moment, except for the founders that got their paycheck and they leave, and on to the next thing. And then the decision-making process, right? Who rolls under whom? How do we make sure it does not result in mass exodus on the acquired organization? Because a lot of the know-how, the knowledge of the asset that you've bought stays with those people. No one can claim that you've done due diligence and you know everything about the company. And then what is the right timing at which you start merging the different components of that acquisition? I've seen them work both ways, to Bill's point. I've been part of an organization where we did the acquisition, we kept them on the side, they continued to grow, and they became big enough that they could be their own business unit. And by then it was too late. You just let them run by itself, which is great internally, but if you go and look at the market and the organization, you're like, what are these guys doing? Why did they even acquire if they were going to leave the company by itself? And I've also seen others where you go try to mix everything up together, and the next thing you know, 60% of the workforce is left. And you're now sitting there with an asset that you have no clue about. You don't know what to do with them. So to Bill's point, it's all very methodical about making sure it's a cultural fit. Sometimes you've got to make a hard decision and draw a line of what the acquisition allows and continues to do, what the acquiree continues to do, and you've got to be methodical in shifting and bringing the people together without disrupting the business.
I don't have a single success story with acquisition to tell. So honestly,
That's fantastic.
I am inherently biased against acquisition because I don't have an experience of anything where we've looked back and said, wow, that was a good choice, guys. Good job, good going, right? So I don't know. I would just say cautious. Like I agree with you. You gotta think about all those things when you're making that decision. But there's a lot of stuff you don't think about that could go wrong. And you mentioned cultural fit. You mentioned, I guess one thing I've said is the smaller acquisitions are less unsuccessful maybe. Like if you're acquiring intellectual property that's going to fit in with your existing operation. But the big acquisitions, there's just more that can go wrong, and there's more of an opportunity for value to be destroyed through that move rather than created. So, yeah.
Let's talk about culture a little bit more. So culture is a term that's thrown around. It often can feel a little amorphous. But you mentioned during due diligence, this is interesting, I never thought about it this way. I don't know if they would assess culture during due diligence, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm curious if you could speak more to how you might assess your own culture and or the fit of another organization to that. Because I would imagine that's a little bit more maybe art than science.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody? Yeah.
Good.
I have so many culture stories. I have to tell you, can I just tell you one other culture story, and then I'll tell you how we assess it?
Yeah.
So culture is this mystic thing, and people say, we have this great culture, right? And it's, and the part that really drives me batshit is when the CEO, I've created a great culture. And culture is an emergent property. It's been studied. People know what it is. So my favorite story on culture, then I'll answer your question, was my previous company, Silverpop, was funded by a West Coast firm called Draper Fisher Jurvetson. And every year they would gather their 100 CEOs together in Silicon Valley. And every year, that what you dreamed of, your dream as an executive was to sit on the stage and be interviewed by one of the partners as you told your story of being acquired. And there was a young guy up there one year who had just sold his company for $100 million when that was unbelievably large. There was a time when a $100 million exit was incredible. And he was very young, and the partner says, tell us what you did. I mean, everybody in the audience wants to be on the stage here. What did you do to make this acquisition, this incredible acquisition work? And this guy says, you know, I empowered my team, and I created an amazing culture. And I every fiber of my being wanted to stand up, and I wanted to say, oh, that's what it is. Okay, because I thought we had to create a stupid, unfun culture. Thank you for that, right? Oh my God. And so one of the things that I've learned working at Engage, and it's doubled down what I've learned doing acquisitions, when you check them out, how are they going to be culture? It is time. You can do the psychological tests. I don't usually think they predict outcomes. You can, you can pick your favorite psychological test, match it against the company you're acquiring, try convincing your CFO you're not going to do an acquisition because those numbers don't match. But you have to spend time with the leaders. Your leaders have to spend time with their leaders. Depending on the cultures, sometimes it might be at a late night at a bar. That's not for many cultures, but for some that it is. But you have to have a chance to really get to know them as people. If it's just like this, where you see these 4 people up here and you hear what they're saying at their very best, you're never going to know them. It's got to be one-on-one. Hours and hours and hours. And if you think that if you're trying to get the transaction done quickly, you're going to go with the numbers, you're going to go with the contracts, you're going to go with the negotiations, you're going to miss the singular thing. And by the way, even if while you're assessing the culture, which you need to have done before you get all the contracts and things underway, the act of committing the time to build the bridges personally will actually dramatically increase the chances of it working, even if the culture fit isn't ideal. But it's that human connection that matters entirely. That's what I love about what we do at Engage.
Super interesting. Yeah.
Even though we don't do acquisitions.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think you touched on a good point, Bill, right? It's tough during an acquisition, during due diligence, to really get a good idea about the culture of the organization and how it fits. I almost equate that to doing an interview with a person. You're always going to get the best side of that candidate. They're obviously not going to come in and violently react or to any question you ask them. But then we know sometimes you do run into situations where people do that. If I could change the acquisition piece, I would love for someone to go in and actually work within the organization that's being acquired, understand the decision-making process, understand where the boundaries are defined between the different groups, how people react to adversity or tough situations. Now that's an ideal world situation, but the next best thing you can do is get to know a lot of the key people at a personal level, outside of a work environment. So you get to know them, you get to know their background, you get to know their thought process, even if it's not work-related, because that gives you, it's a decent proxy of how the culture fit's going to happen.
Yeah.
Super interesting.
a really good idea. I mean, this is an idea, nothing I've ever tried because I've never been successful at it, but why not structure an early agreement where you're experimenting together and learning about one another's culture on a small scale at low risk, right? Like you could potentially do that. It might look like something like that. We're going to trade executives. We're going to shadow people, right?
You know, it's the second or third word in the title. It's partnership, right? What a great way to test drive your partnership as a test. And some companies do that intentionally. So partnership is the first step to acquisition.
Love it. Yeah.
Great.
So it's not a unique idea. Thank you for pointing that out.
I think it's a fantastic idea. I'm crediting you fully.
So let me pause here to take a couple of questions. I saw one, I think it was Ellen.
One of the challenges is that the layer, especially if you're involving public companies, you can't legally disclose that you're considering an acquisition until you're pretty far through. So you have this tension between the short number of people you can tell the large public company and within your own small company that you're going to do this, but you want it to be as big as possible. And so there's a lot of art in that. And even then, if you two small, like if it's smaller companies, I ran a company called IXL. We acquired 30 some companies before we were also public. But one of the questions is, who are the people that are leading your organization? The second question is, who are the people who are the influencers, the go-to people, regardless of their title? And most leaders, when you're talking to them, know who those people are in their companies. Especially if it's not a gigantic company with hundreds of thousands of people, the CEO will typically know, well, it's actually Sam and Sally over here, and the support when there's an interview coming in from the media or there's a customer, we pull them out of their day job and put them here because they really understand the culture. So I think you can quickly get that. IBM had an interesting model, so many things they did, but one of them was like rank the CEO, rank the most influential people in your company 1 through N. And I had never really thought about it that way, and I was surprised that the sort of 1 through 3 were not people that would have been seen as the clear top executives.
Other questions?
So I'll take it. I mean, so I think every organization of all kinds operates at 1 or 3 levels. It basically operates at reactive level, which is where most organizations are. It's defined by how often it's reacting to something they didn't expect. And there's an execution level, which is where it's pretty predictable. They're hitting numbers, putting out products in a way that they plan to. And then there's a strategic level, and those are the companies that define disruptions and define winners. And those are folks that are executing so well they can actually step back and take a week off for an offsite to plan what they want to do. And I think when you're thinking about partnerships, you really need to be honest with yourself about where you're at, because if you're in the reactive level, you're probably going to really struggle to manage any partnerships, whether you need it desperately, especially if it's a two-way partnership where you're not just writing. I mean, partnership can often mean I'm paying this third party a lot of money to do stuff for me, but when you actually have to work arm in arm, cohesively, collaboratively, you will only make your reactive situation worse if you expect some third party to come in. And I think the other extreme answer to your question is sometimes it's useful, appropriate, always painful just to do a Control-Delete. And that's a term for people that don't live in the Mac world. It takes a Microsoft Windows computer to start over again, which a long time ago used to be something you did regularly. And so I think that at some point, if you think your answers come from partnerships, the answer is probably actually Control-Delete. It looks like a solution. It's the worst thing you can do.
I think it's, when you start thinking about the long-term, short-term, I think it's important to understand sometimes the objective behind the partnership. Typically, short-term partnerships or short-term goals are more around, increasing your revenue, increasing your margin. You've got to get it done. It's not always the best choice, but you've got to weigh the pros and cons of what happens once we get to our goal. Does it mean the partnership continues? Does it end? Does it go a little bit dormant now that we've achieved the goal and we're in a steady run state? Mm-hmm. That's often a question that happens sometimes with not technology folks on the table, right? But when you're looking at a long-term partnership or you're looking at some level of integration, I think it's important that you've got a technology point of view, because what you can't do is sign up with something, and to enable that, it's going to take 12 months plus to get it up and running, hopefully. while the partnership expectations at the business side were like, oh, this is a short putt, right? We should get it done, and we should be up and running. So it's important to have that point of view and opinion and be vocal about it.
Yeah.
So 2 thoughts for you. I think the implicit in your question is the navigation of this unnavigable tension between short-term and long-term, right? And I think that I'm a strategist primarily. That's how I think and work, and I like long-term a lot. But I think about back in the 80s, Japan was heralded in the United States because they explicitly took a long-term view of business, and there was business school classes and consultants that talked about this. And guess what? It turned out not to be. 20 years later, it wasn't necessarily inherently. We look at it from a government point of view. China taking an explicitly long-term view, and we lament for many valid reasons what the U.S. government does inherently short-term. And so I think that the jury's out on where the balance needs to live geopolitically. Companies, startups must be more short-term because they have to survive each new phase. But the one other thought I'll give you, my wife and I are watching this Netflix show called Madam Secretary, which is fun. It's about the Secretary of State. And one of the reasons we like it, and because I've been a leader most of my life, a business leader, and the fun thing about that show is it shows what happens to get these fictional things happen, but all the stuff behind the scenes. And I think one of the challenges when you're looking outside, if you're like a public equities analyst or something, you're looking at the decisions that a company's made, and you're saying, boy, you should have a longer term view. I would say that what actually happens, a la Madam Secretary, is sometimes the things that they did next were out of absolute disaster avoidance, holy cow, and then the best they can do is paper it up to say this was a short-term decision. And so actually to survive long-term requires a lot of decisions that are so difficult, and if they're done correctly and led correctly, the people who are not in the inner circle don't appreciate, we just missed another nuclear bomb. I think when it comes to strategy and what you do at a firm like Engage, and you get asked a really deep question like that, my answer is typically ask Lisa. I think that, but it does speak to your question, Lisa. I think it speaks to the, actually serious, I do ask Lisa for most of it, but how do you balance the emergencies and all the resources it takes to actually just survive so that the duck still looks like it's floating across the water? And how do you prepare for those inevitably to happen? And I think that mindset is a longer term mindset, right? Even though you're not necessarily doing anything that looks strategically transformative, you're actually just setting yourself up, you're lifting yourself out of reactive mode into execution mode. And that takes a ton of energy that smooth duck going across the water you don't appreciate. So I think when you're thinking about investment, within the range of you have way too little resources and way too many resources, I think you have to spend a lot of time thinking about how do we just double down on doing what we do that our customers are expecting us to do exceptionally well in a very resilient way. And then when you get that going really well, then you take you should have extra resources, and then you say, what could we do if we could do anything? And that's and you always have to do that last question you have to ask, just because you have to have a North Star, but how much you can put into doing that. And so I've joined Engage to try to see this, because I'm not going to tell you what we do, but which is a really cool organization, and it has a ton of promise, and our customers love us. We have great NPS scores. So how do we, I think we're at a point where we can ask, how do we make that larger? Where do we invest? And how do we invest? And how much of it is in the big shiny things? And how much of it is just shoring up the stuff we do day to day, which is exceptionally challenging to do. We call it spinning plates.
I mean, I like we sort of maybe to take this partner to buy idea a little bit further. Like, I like the idea of experimenting with a partner early. Like, so it is something in the example of working with Canadians with the insurance company. So that company was on our radar. It was an early stage startup, and we had a specific goal in mind and a value prop that we wanted to test that they were helping us with. But I think if it's an interesting company, you can come up with an experiment that you can execute together and learn more about the space as a new entrant into that space. They can learn more about you and determine if there's a cultural fit, if there's strategic alignment, and all of those things. So Well, what the experimental mindset is designed to do is to reduce risk, right? So if you're operating in a small space within a market, instead of like I'm immediately going global, for example, then my risk is contained to a small area. And so, I don't know the risk aversion of the people you're talking about, but finding a way to get to speak their language in terms of risk mitigation with whatever you're doing is really the way to do it, I think. So
I think your risk appetite also matters,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Smaller company, you'll get more things done. You're taking a risk on stability of the business for the long term. You go partner with a bigger company, your risk is this is going to take me 6 months before anything even happens remotely. But yes, I have a lot of stability.
Yeah.
So it really boils down to like, what is the short-term, long-term need of this partnership plus acquisition play that your firm is looking at?
Different type of risk, I
Yeah.
like that, yeah.
So,
I actually want to add just one very cynical thing to this, which is uncharacteristically cynical for me. But I think, I can't recall, as you guys were talking, like as a startup person, and who's known the startup community for a long time, earlier stage companies, I can't remember a time where somebody said, actually I can think of one, but like where somebody said, boy, I'm really glad we partnered with big company X. That was transformative. That was the reason we were successful. So I think that what that means is to say that partnerships are really valuable. If a small company works with a big company, it can be very helpful. But if you ever try to view it through the lens that this is going to take us to the next level, it's pretty unlikely statistically.
So we've got just a few minutes left, and I want to make sure we at least touch on build, because we've obviously talked a lot about partner and, of course, buying. I guess the way I'd frame the question is, it seems obvious in most cases, hey, we have a capability, we have people, let's just go build it. But it feels like if we're really thinking about build, buy, partner as a strategy, the decision-making process should be a little bit more complicated, or at least a little bit more insightful, right? Other than just like, we have people, let's do it. So I'd be curious, maybe what advice would you give to people who are generally starting with build? Because I feel like build, again, is in many cases the easiest one to reach out to, and yet maybe there's other ways to think about it.
In my opinion, I think it boils down to, do you have the skill set in-house, or is there going to be a learning curve before you can actually get to actually doing the build? And B, do you want to own that IP because you think it's going to be transformative for your organization? If the answer is very quickly no, I don't have the skill set, or I could go get this from 20 other people, or there are 20 other people doing this, you've got to really look at that build decision and figure out, is this the right thing that I'm focusing on? Because whether it's a big company, small company, startup, there's finite number of resources, you've got to shuffle and juggle priorities, and you've got to figure out what delivers the maximum value for you. So I've always looked at that. Yes, it'll be nice for us to build everything, but to me, it's the 2 or 3 things that if the answer is not overwhelmingly yes, we should do this, it very quickly shifts to the buy or partner side of the discussion.
A quick show of hands. How many of you think you live in the startup high growth world, and how many of you think and the second one will be how much do you live in the larger, more established company world? So how many of you live in the startup-y world? All right, how many of you live in the larger company world? Okay, I was just curious, because I think the answer couldn't be more different.
Right.
And one of the great case studies in large business, which will get told over time, is General Electric decided in about 7 or 8 years ago that in order they needed to get out of just making stuff, they needed to control it, and they watched an entire ecosystem build around. So they got into the software business, and it was just when I became strategist at IBM, and the question was, the mighty GE is going to come after us, and they're going to take over, because IBM did a lot of work augmenting the hardware systems that GE sold. And I've talked to so many people in the GE it was, I think, by every measure, a disaster. And if any of you are in the GE world feel differently, come tell me, but there's books written about it. And so I think that was really, to your point, like, do you have any idea how to write software? And software is a cultural thing. So I think part of the answer is, do your leaders actually understand? And one of my observations when I was reading out to the CEO of IBM, it says the companies you're competing with, we compete with, many of the leaders are very technical, and they're creating technical products. And Ginny, you are an amazing leader, one of the most impressive people I've ever met, but you are not technical. And so the decisions and the lens through which you make these decisions for IBM are done through a sales mentality, and you're competing with the CEO of Microsoft and Apple, who are essentially technologists. And I think so culturally, that's the most fundamental question we were thinking about build. And so, okay.
That's great.
For large companies.
We have about 5-ish minutes left. I know, Sean, you had a question. I know it might be from the section before, but yeah.
Is the difference between I'm going to check the box that we're doing something here, like I'm going to check the box they have a partnership, versus we're going to go all in and we're going to be really, really upset if it doesn't work, and we're betting our business on it. Microsoft's famous and excellent at doing that, betting the entire business, as they've just done with OpenAI. I mean, they've done that over and over and over again. I'm not a huge fan of Microsoft, but boy, when they say we're going to do a thing, they dive in so hard, and they literally bet the company. From what I've seen, I've never worked there, but it's impressive. And so few companies are willing, startups or big companies, can make that kind of commitment. Oh, it's leadership, 100% leadership, in my opinion. I mean, Bill Gates wrote a memo in the 80s, and he said, everything we've done online, we're throwing away. It's famous, it's business school class reading. And he said, starting today, we are going to either fire or turn over everybody to work on this thing called the internet. And we are going to become a 100% internet company. And the change in 6 months from Microsoft, I mean, they went from, they were going to die because the internet was happening, to the internet leader. I mean, all the early internet connections were done on Microsoft stacks, IP, modems, and they're doing the same thing with AI. That's leadership, 100%.
Sorry, I can't read your name tag. You were talking about 4 years post-merger, right? Do you guys have milestones that you're working towards, right? So there's always milestones in the integration, right? So you have to have milestones that track progress against whatever you set out to do, which hopefully with the build buy partner decision was a value creation of some sort. Now, what you might learn, especially as you get further away from, well, no, you might learn it in all of them, is that actually the goalpost has changed along the way. I can't imagine it 4 years later that the milestones are the same milestones you were probably measuring from the get-go. So you have to be flexible with, we've learned something with this decision that changes the game for us. We're changing our milestones to achieve something else other than what we thought we were going to achieve. So I think, especially for the long-term game, that's likely to happen. But you're still pointed towards success from some decision.
A funny story. So my company, Silverpop, almost got acquired by Salesforce.com twice. And so we were going to be the first acquisition they'd ever made. And it was fascinating, and talking about milestones and goal setting and how are you fluid. I remember after the first time we almost got acquired, and the second time was IBM, which is way better fit for us, and more money. But the first time I was getting inside of Salesforce.com, and I thought, this company is going to absolutely fail. I mean, this company can go nowhere. Their leadership is histrionic. You know, Mark Benioff is as crazy as you think Steve Jobs is. He's crazier, and you know, they just, everything was like this. And then the thing that drove me crazy about them, because I'm sort of a strategist, was every 6 months they would completely make all their new milestones from scratch. Like everything they said they were going to do, all the promises they made to customers, they just like, as if that never existed. And they said, now we're going to do this. We're going to be big in this, and this is our go-to-market now, 6 months later. And they documented it all, and then they would do a complete change and have no memory. And if we were partners of theirs, like, what, you know, we're supposed to do this thing. And I think the absolute hyper, I won't call it ruthlessness, but just inclination towards the next best action turned out to be, instead of what I thought was a company imploding thing, turned out to be one of their core advantages. So I think milestones can become anchors, especially for startups.
Yeah. And as long as the North Star is defined, you can have a different path of getting there, because it takes time to execute each milestone, and you may get to that point and survey what's going on outside, and the world might have changed.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right? So, but you're still trying to get to that end point. It's like coming from Johns Creek here. Waze is constantly finding the shortest path. And I'm like, you can take me through whatever by streets, but I got to get here, right? And if it takes me an hour or 40 minutes, who cares? We'll just adjust as the conditions are changing.
I was talking to my partner this weekend about this very topic. And I said, I'm happiest when I'm putting my strategist brain on. But one of the things I learned at IBM is that nearly all the strategy I've done is I was also the leader or a leader. And strategy separated from leadership is actually a completely different animal. And so I think I don't have a really optimistic, happy answer for you. I think strategy, it's a good characteristic for a leader to have. I think it helps align a company if they're wired that way, because you can explain why we're doing what we're doing and people see the reason for it. They see the long-term versus short-term trade-offs with more clarity, for example. But I think like Mark Benioff, who runs Salesforce.com, he is not remotely a strategist, and his companies have done better than mine. And so I think strategy is, particularly in the startup world, is overrated, generally speaking. And I think for large companies, they often vested in an organization like the one I ran at IBM. And I think that's probably where strategy matters the most. But of course, if you want really great strategy, as we wrap this up, you should talk to the people at 352 who are just really great. They're not paying me. They're not paying me.
We really aren't. We really aren't.
I just want to wrap it up on a pachoom, drop the mic.
It's beautiful. It made me tear up. All right, so last question for you guys. Thank you guys for all the great questions. If you imagined yourself as like a young 22, 25-year-old, and muscles are rippling, and like life, there was a long life ahead, right? And I'm not trying to be pessimistic now, but there's a long life ahead. Career is unplanned. What advice would you give yourself trying to do this type of work that you wish you knew back then?
You lost me at 25 and they said muscles rippling.
Yeah.
I was like, I can't imagine walking on the moon. I can't imagine walking on the moon either.
Yeah.
Start with you first.
Yeah, I have a 19-year-old son, almost 20-year-old son, so it applies. Like, it's a journey. Don't worry too much about right now, because, man, in 20 years, it's going to be very different than whatever you're planning. I think business is like that too, right? Like you make decisions in the short term, hoping for a long term, but what matters is that North Star. Are you happy and successful in your personal life? Are we as a business successful in our professional lives? And the journey to get there is not predictable for you right now, is what I would say.
Fair enough.
Yeah. I would probably advise me at 25 to take a little bit more risk professionally.
Yeah.
I think, I don't know, I migrated from India and came here to the US to go to grad school, and I almost kind of always took a risk-averse path in my career. Wanted to go work in big companies, get stability, learn from that and figure out when was the next time to move. But I think that is the right age to take risk.
Yeah.
It's not very wise for me to jump in and go to a pre-seed company right now and say, let's do this. It'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But the risk-reward equation changes as you progress in your career. So that's what I would advise myself.
When people who are coming out of college ask me for advice, my strongest advice is the most important decision, and if you work for a mid-sized or smaller company, you have some control over it, you will make the single best thing you can do for your career. It doesn't matter what industry, what pay, what title, is you need to be working for somebody who actually is deeply vested in your career development and your professional skills development. And wherever you find that person, that's the place you should work. And I have seen that play out so many times. And if you don't have it, if you work for a very large company and you can't control this, it changes, you find mentors. And you'd be shocked, especially if you're 22, 23, how many people are happy to be mentors. And it's all about somebody who's looking at you through the lens of who you really are, and can translate that for you into what their experience tells you it means in the professional world.
That's awesome. Well, please give a big hand for our panelists. That has been incredible. Thank you guys for coming out. I'm sure these guys can stick around for a few minutes to answer some questions, but we'll see you guys next month with another event. So looking forward to it. Thank you guys.